Elon Musk wasn't a man easily shocked. After all, the CEO of Tesla, SpaceX, and now Twitter had seen his fair share of the unexpected, from electric cars revolutionizing the automobile industry to rockets landing back on Earth. Yet nothing could have prepared him for what he would discover in the depths of the USAID building. It all started with a seemingly ordinary invitation, a private meeting with high-ranking officials from the United States Agency for International Development. Musk had been involved with various humanitarian and technological efforts, and USAID was one of the largest organizations in the world dedicated to providing aid to developing countries. They claimed to foster global development, but Musk knew better than to take everything at face value. There were always layers beneath the surface, and he'd learned long ago that no one had clean hands when it came to power and influence. As he walked into the sleek glass building of USAID in Washington, D.C., Musk could feel an odd tension in the air, one that seemed to press against his chest. The lobby was pristine, filled with quiet activity as officials and staff went about their business, but there was something about the place that felt off. He couldn't put his finger on it. The security was tighter than usual, the atmosphere more guarded, but he shrugged it off. He had bigger things to focus on. The meeting itself was routine, or so it seemed. Musk listened as USAID officials discussed various programs, from economic development to public health initiatives, all of which were designed to improve lives in underdeveloped regions around the globe. As always, the agency spoke with polished rhetoric about their success stories, about how they were making the world a better place. But then, something caught Musk's eye. As the presentation wrapped up and people began filing out of the room, he noticed a folder left behind on the conference table. It wasn't an ordinary folder. It had no markings, no name or title on it. Just a plain brown folder with a thick stack of documents inside. Curious, Musk approached the table, his mind racing. He should have just left it alone, but something about it drew him in. It was as though the folder had been placed there on purpose just for him. Without thinking, he reached for the folder and flipped it open. At first, the contents appeared to be reports and data from various overseas projects. But then, as he skimmed through the pages, his heart began to race. The further he read, the more he realized how deeply these documents diverged from what USAID had told the public. There were coded financial figures, bizarre references to political figures, and even mention of a secret initiative involving foreign governments. The pages weren't just about aid, they were about control, power, influence. Musk's head began to spin as the weight of the documents sank in. Who was behind this? And more importantly, why was it hidden? Before he could finish reading, he heard footsteps approaching. Panicked, he quickly shoved the folder under his arm and made his way to the exit, his mind reeling. The last thing he needed was to be caught with sensitive information. But as he stepped out into the bright Washington sunlight, his curiosity got the best of him. The folder felt heavier than it had moments ago. The questions echoed in his mind. What exactly had he just stumbled upon? He had to know more. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward even when things get tough? Elon Musk couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The folder weighed heavily in his bag as he returned to his car, and his mind raced. He had seen a lot of things in his career, but this felt different. USAID, the very agency that the world trusted to help developing nations, was hiding something big. The question now wasn't just what they were hiding, but why. Musk arrived at his Tesla headquarters late that evening. He entered his office, shut the door, and dumped the contents of the folder onto his desk. The documents were cryptic, filled with jargon and financial data that made little sense at first glance. But something about the numbers stuck out. They were linked to foreign governments, business dealings that seemed more like shadowy agreements than legitimate contracts. As he examined the papers further, he came across one particular report that chilled him to the bone. It described a project in Africa, one that was officially about infrastructure development, but the hidden details suggested it was much more. There were references to mining rights and government deals that, on the surface, appeared to benefit the people, but beneath it all, Musk saw manipulation and exploitation. He couldn't help but ask himself, Is this really what they're doing in the name of aid? His phone buzzed, breaking his thoughts. It was a text from his trusted assistant, Sarah. "Elon, be careful. We've noticed some irregularities in your meeting schedule at USAID. Do you need help?" He paused, wondering if Sarah had overheard something. But then it clicked. She had been at the same meeting earlier, and now she was sounding the alarm. He typed back quickly, "I'm going to need more than help. I think we've just stumbled onto something huge. Meet me at the office in 30 minutes. Musk's mind was spinning, but one thing was clear. The deeper he went, the more dangerous this was becoming. He had just uncovered a fraction of a much bigger picture, and the more he looked, the more it seemed like USAID was not the benevolent organization they portrayed themselves to be. In fact, they might be the very ones pulling the strings behind the scenes. Sarah arrived soon after. As she entered his office, Musk noticed the concern etched on her face. She was always calm under pressure, but today there was something different about her. "I've been running some checks," Sarah said, setting down her bag. "There's more to those documents than just financial schemes. They're using the aid initiatives as a cover for something darker, like a hidden agenda to control resources in developing countries." Musk leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. "What do you mean?" "I've found some communications between USAID and a few of their partners in some African nations. It looks like they've been manipulating local governments, offering aid in exchange for political favors. And it's not just Africa. There are signs of this in Central and South America too." Musk ran a hand through his hair. This could be huge. But if we're right, we're talking about some of the most powerful people in the world. They won't let us expose this easily. "Then we expose it the right way," Sarah said, her voice firm. "We gather the evidence, find the right allies, and we blow the lid off this. It's the only way to stop them." Musk nodded slowly. He knew. Sarah was right. If they were going to go through with this, they had to be careful. They had to gather more information, get more proof, and find out who was really behind this. But it wasn't going to be easy, and it certainly wasn't going to be safe. The stakes were higher now, and Musk had just crossed a line he couldn't uncross. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The next few days were a blur for Elon Musk and Sarah. They worked around the clock, gathering information and following leads, trying to make sense of the mess they'd uncovered. But the deeper they dug into the files, the darker and more complicated everything seemed to get. It was clear that the web of corruption inside USAID was far bigger than they had initially imagined. Musk couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. He'd gone from a tech billionaire to an accidental whistleblower, and now he wasn't sure if he could turn back. Every decision they made seemed to push them closer to the point of no return. "We need more proof," Sarah said one evening. As they sat in Musk's office, the glow of their laptop screens casting shadows on their faces. "The documents we have are solid, but we need to connect the dots, show the world that USAID is more than just an aid organization. We need to prove that they're controlling entire governments, exploiting resources under the guise of charity." Musk stared at the screen. The documents on it were enough to bring down entire organizations, but that was only part of the battle. What he needed now was someone who could help him expose it to the world without it being buried. And that wasn't going to be easy. As if on cue, Musk's phone buzzed. It was a text from an anonymous source that had been feeding him information for weeks now. He hesitated before opening it. "Meet me at the old warehouse on 5th. It's urgent." He looked at Sarah. "This could be our chance," he said, his voice low but filled with determination. "If we get there in time, maybe we can uncover something that will blow this whole thing wide open." Sarah didn't hesitate. "Let's go." The warehouse was an eerie place. Long abandoned and shrouded in darkness, it felt like something straight out of a spy movie. The kind of place where secrets were buried and deals were made in the shadows. Musk and Sarah parked their car a block away and walked cautiously toward the building, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the empty streets. As they stepped inside, they were greeted by the dim light of a single flickering bulb overhead. The warehouse was massive, filled with old crates and rusting machinery. But in the center of the room was a man, tall, thin, wearing a black hoodie. His face was partially obscured by the shadows, but his eyes glinted in the low light. "You're late," he said, his voice cold. Musk didn't flinch. "What's so important that you dragged us here?" he asked, his tone equally serious. The man stepped forward, handing Musk a thick envelope. "Inside," he said, "you'll find the final piece of the puzzle, the truth about USAID and the people behind it. But be careful. Once you open this, there's no going back. They'll come for you." Musk took the envelope, his mind racing. "Who exactly is they?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he turned and began to walk away, disappearing into the shadows of the warehouse. Without wasting another second, Musk opened the envelope. Inside was a set of photographs and documents. The photos showed meetings between top USAID officials and political leaders, some of them in high positions within governments Musk had never suspected. There were also detailed accounts of resource deals, secretly orchestrated to siphon wealth from struggling nations under the guise of aid programs. The connections were so deep, so intricate, that it almost seemed like a coordinated effort to control entire regions of the world. And then there was the final piece, a map. The map marked several countries across Africa, Central and South America, with red circles indicating hot zones, places where USAID's influence was most deeply entrenched. The map also had coordinates and a list of names, some of which were shockingly familiar to Musk. Politicians, corporate executives, and even a few military figures. It was clear that USAID wasn't just an organization anymore, it was part of a global conspiracy. Musk felt a chill run down his spine as he looked at the final document. It was a memo outlining a covert operation, something about using international aid as leverage to manipulate governments into supporting a new global economic order. The document was dated just 6 months ago. He looked up at Sarah, whose face had gone pale as she read over his shoulder. This is bigger than I thought," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We're talking about global control. USAID isn't just aiding developing nations. It's orchestrating a massive power play." Musk clenched his fists, his mind spinning. The deeper he went, the more dangerous this became. The people behind this had no intention of being exposed, and Musk knew that if he was going to bring this to light, he would have to act fast. "We're going to need allies," Musk said, his voice hardening with resolve, "and we're going to need to be smart. If we move too quickly, they'll bury this before we even get a chance to speak." "Out." Sarah nodded, looking at him with a sense of determination he hadn't seen in her before. "Then let's do it. The world needs to know." The next few days were a whirlwind of strategy, planning, and endless risk. Elon Musk and Sarah knew they were sitting on a goldmine of information, but the magnitude of what they had uncovered was beginning to sink in. Every document, every photograph, every connection they had found was a potential bombshell. But the more they pieced together, the more they realized the full extent of what they were up against. Sarah had been working around the clock, reaching out to journalists and investigators who could help them spread the word. Musk, meanwhile, had begun the difficult task of deciding who they could trust. They couldn't afford to make a wrong move. The people behind USAID's operations weren't just influential, they were powerful enough to silence anyone who posed a threat to them. But Musk wasn't the kind of man who backed down from a challenge. He had fought for his companies before, against competitors, critics, and even governments. But this was different. This wasn't a tech battle or a business rivalry. This was a fight for the truth, and Musk knew that once he stepped into this arena, there would be no turning back. One night, as Musk sat in his office, scanning through the documents once more, his phone rang. It was a secure line. "Mr. Musk," a familiar voice said on the other end. It was Sarah. "I think we've found something." Musk's pulse quickened. "What is it?" "There's a man, a whistleblower from within USAID. His name's Gregory Harrison. He's a former senior consultant who worked directly with the Africa division. He's been trying to leak information for years but was silenced. He's willing to meet with us." Musk leaned forward. "Where?" "A small diner on the outskirts of town. It's isolated. No one will recognize us there." "I'll be there in 20, Musk said, already standing up. The diner was as quiet as Sarah had promised. A small, unassuming place with an old neon sign flickering outside and the smell of coffee and greasy food filling the air. Musk and Sarah sat at a corner booth, waiting for Gregory Harrison. Minutes felt like hours as they watched the door, both tense with anticipation. Finally, the door opened, and a man in his late 40s walked in. He was average height with graying hair and a nervous look in his eyes. He looked around the diner before his gaze landed on Musk and Sarah. Without a word, he made his way over to them and slid into the booth. "Mr. Musk, Miss Sarah," he said, shaking their hands. His grip was tight, but there was a tremor to it, like he was afraid of being seen. "I'm glad you contacted me, but we don't have much time." Musk nodded. "We're listening." Gregory leaned in, lowering his voice. "What you found, those documents, the maps, the photos, they're just the tip of the iceberg. I've seen it firsthand. USAID is involved in operations that go far beyond aid. They've been setting up a system of control from the bottom up. It's not just resources. They've been manipulating entire economies, turning governments into puppets, and the worst part is, they've been doing it under the radar for decades." Sarah's eyes widened. "How long has this been going on?" "Since the late 90s, Gregory said. "I've seen them rig elections in Africa, control resource markets, and even sabotage rival nations, all while pretending to be the good guys. They've set up offshore accounts, bribes, and backdoor deals with multinational corporations. They've been pulling the strings behind the scenes, and most people have no idea." Musk's mind was racing. He had suspected as much, but hearing it from someone with inside knowledge made it all the more real. The conspiracy wasn't just about USAID. It was a network of global corruption, and USAID was at the center of it. Gregory continued. "I've got proof, hard evidence, financial records, emails, and photos that tie the agency to some of the most powerful people in the world. If you want to expose them, this is it, but you need to be careful. I'm not the only one who knows about this. There are people inside USAID who have been monitoring everything. They know who you are." Musk looked at Sarah. "We don't have a choice, do we?" "No," Sarah replied, her voice steely. "We do this now. We go public with everything. We bring the truth to light." Gregory hesitated. "You can't just release it all at once. If you do, they'll shut it down before it even hits the press. You need to go after them step by step, expose them in pieces, start small, gain traction, and then hit them with the full force." Musk's eyes narrowed as he processed Gregory's advice. "How do we start?" Gregory pulled out a small folder from his jacket. He slid it across the table to Musk. "This is just the beginning. It's a list of names, high-ranking officials, political figures, corporate execs who are deeply involved. They're the ones you need to go after first." Musk didn't even need to open the folder. He could see the gravity in Gregory's eyes. This wasn't just about exposing USAID anymore. This was about toppling an entire global system of corruption, one brick at a time. "Thank you," Musk said, tucking the folder under his arm. "We'll make sure your name stays out of this, but we're doing this for everyone." Gregory stood up, his hands shaking as he prepared to leave. "Just remember, this is bigger than you think, and if they come after you, they'll come after everyone you care about." As Gregory walked out of the diner, Musk and Sarah exchanged a long look. They knew they had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But the truth had to be revealed, no matter the cost. The hours after Gregory left the diner were some of the longest in Elon Musk's life. The folder he had handed over felt like a ticking time bomb. He and Sarah sat in the quiet of his office, staring at the folder between them, as the enormity of their next steps weighed heavily on them. "Where do we even start?" Sarah finally asked, her voice tinged with both urgency and uncertainty. The information Gregory had given them was invaluable, but it was also overwhelming. It was a maze of names, dates, locations, and deals. All of it was linked to powerful, dangerous people. Musk opened the folder slowly. He saw a list of names, some of which he recognized, high-ranking figures from around the world, leaders of major corporations, and even members of governments. But one name stood out to him. It was marked in bold letters, Jonathan Fields. The name of a well-known international financier and philanthropist who had been a major donor to various global causes, including the World Bank and of course, USAID. Musk's gut tightened. Fields, he muttered under his breath. He's one of them. Sarah leaned in. You think he's involved in all of this? Musk nodded. He's been pulling the strings from the shadows for years. We need to dig deeper on him, find out what exactly he's been up to. He scanned through the documents, his eyes scanning rapidly. Each file, each piece of evidence was leading them closer to something that felt too dangerous to uncover, but also too important not to. These weren't just corporate moguls or corrupt officials they were dealing with. These were the people who had quietly orchestrated global chaos. Let's start with Fields, Musk said. We have to know everything about him, his businesses, his connections, his deals. If he's the one at the sea, top of this pyramid, then we expose him first. It wasn't long before Musk and Sarah had gathered a substantial amount of information about Jonathan Fields. He had spent years creating a network of influence, from government contracts to underground deals. He had been involved in some of the world's largest corporate mergers, often using charity and aid as a cover to broker backroom deals. But the most chilling discovery was one of the most recent ventures Fields had financed, a project in Africa that claimed to provide healthcare to millions. Musk and Sarah had learned that behind the scenes, Fields was leveraging this humanitarian aid project to seize control of Africa's most precious resource, cobalt. Cobalt. It was the very element that powered electric cars, batteries, and all things tech, and Fields had made sure that the majority of cobalt mining rights in the region were controlled by companies he owned, all disguised as aid projects. Musk's face hardened as he looked at Sarah. He's using aid to monopolize resources. This is beyond what I thought. If we expose him now, it'll send shockwaves through the global economy. Sarah's eyes were filled with determination, and it'll give us the leverage we need to take down the rest of them. But as Musk sat back, his mind was already racing ahead. The only way to bring Fields down was to make sure the world knew what was really going on, but exposing someone of his caliber wasn't going to be easy. Fields had a network of loyalists, politicians, and legal teams that would do anything to protect him. We're going to need a plan, Musk said. We can't just drop everything at once. We have to be strategic about this. We need the media. We need public pressure. The plan the next few days were a blur as Musk, Sarah, and their small team put their plan into motion. They knew they couldn't expose Fields directly without preparation. They would need to approach this methodically, targeting the weak points in his operations. Sarah reached out to some of the investigative journalists she had worked with in the past, while Musk used his vast network of tech contacts to uncover any dirt that might be hidden in Fields' dealings. Every lead they followed seemed to connect back to the same conclusion. Jonathan Fields was the mastermind behind much of the corruption they had uncovered, and his operation was not only widespread, but global. But the more they uncovered, the more they realized how deep the web stretched. Fields' involvement in government contracts, corporate mergers, and backdoor deals went beyond USAID. It was embedded in the very fabric of international politics. Musk could no longer look at this as just a corporate scandal. This was a conspiracy of global proportions. One night, as Sarah compiled the last of the documents they had gathered, Musk sat back and took a breath. He knew what they had to do next. We start with a public release, Musk said, his voice steady. We leak the first set of documents to the press, starting with the cobalt deal. That'll hit Fields where it hurts. Once we get the media talking, we can start putting pressure on his network. We'll have the world watching. Sarah nodded, her face grim but resolute. It's dangerous, but it's the only way. Musk's fingers hovered over the keyboard as he prepared the press release. He knew once they hit send, there would be no going back. The world would know the truth. And with it, there was no telling what kind of fallout they would face, but there was no turning back now. The pieces were all in place, and the plan was set in motion. As the press release went live, Musk and Sarah sat back and watched as the first stories began to break. Headlines exploded across the globe, reporting on the scandalous deal involving Jonathan Fields and the exploitation of cobalt in Africa under the guise of aid. The media, always hungry for a sensational story, latched onto it immediately. It wasn't long before the first wave of public outrage started to rise. People were demanding answers, politicians were scrambling to make statements, and fields of international corporations were suddenly under scrutiny. But as expected, Fields' team wasted no time fighting back, using every resource at their disposal to discredit Musk, Sarah, and the story. Musk braced himself. "This is just the beginning," he muttered. "But it's enough to make them panic." The morning after the press release went live, the fallout was immediate. Social media exploded and the news networks went into overdrive. Headlines splashed across every major outlet. Global scandal. USAID's secret deal with Jonathan Fields. Exposed, but as quickly as the world began to react, the counterattacks began to pour in. Within hours, Jonathan Fields' legal team issued a statement vehemently denying all allegations. He called the leak fabricated, and his spokespeople were on every news station, painting Musk and Sarah as opportunistic liars trying to take down a well-respected philanthropist. Fields is known worldwide for his humanitarian efforts, one news anchor reported. There is no evidence to support these allegations, and experts believe this is just an attempt to discredit him. But it wasn't just Fields' team that was reacting. The backlash was coming from all sides. Politicians who had long relied on Fields' donations were scrambling to distance themselves, even as some went on the offensive, accusing Musk and Sarah of political sabotage. Musk could feel the pressure mounting from every angle. "They really think people will buy this," Sarah muttered as she scrolled through the media storm on her tablet. "We've got the documents, the proof, but they're twisting it all. They're trying to make us look like criminals." Musk stared. At the screen, his jaw clenched. He wasn't used to being vilified in this way. He had fought battles before, but this was different. They weren't just attacking his businesses. They were attacking his integrity, his credibility. He couldn't let them win, not now. "We're not backing down," Musk said, his voice hard. "They want to silence us? Fine. Let's turn the tables. We give them more." As the days passed, it became clear that the first wave of the backlash was merely a diversion. Fields and his allies were doing everything they could to paint the leak as a personal vendetta. They tried to undermine the credibility of the journalists who were covering the story, even going as far as questioning the authenticity of the documents Musk and Sarah had released. But Musk wasn't going to let it die. The backlash was part of the plan. He knew that, and Sarah knew it too. The goal was always to get the media's attention, stir up controversy, and force Fields into a corner. The moment Fields denied everything was the moment the world started asking questions. So Musk and Sarah decided to escalate things further. They had one more piece of the puzzle to reveal, the final evidence that would prove without a doubt that Fields was manipulating governments through his aid programs. This was their last card, and they were prepared to play it. "We need to take them down," Musk said one night as he paced around his office. "The press, the world, they've all been fed the story that Fields is a good guy. We need to show them who he really is. We need the final proof, the smoking gun." Sarah nodded, her face set with determination. "We've got it. I've been digging through the rest of the files. There's one last deal, one that links Fields directly to me, a military dictatorship in South America. It's all here, the payments, the deals, the reports. If we release this—" Musk stopped pacing and looked directly at her. "It'll be the end of him." The next day, Sarah arranged for an encrypted transfer of the final documents. It was a detailed financial audit of Fields' dealings in a small unnamed country in South America. The audit showed a series of illegal arms deals conducted under the guise of foreign aid meant for disaster relief. In these documents, Fields wasn't just a philanthropist. He was a key player in funneling military weapons into a country with a notorious human rights record. The ramifications of these revelations would be global. Musk knew that once these documents hit the media, Fields would be exposed not just as a profiteer, but as a criminal mastermind hiding behind a mask of charity. The release went live that afternoon. The effect was instantaneous. As soon as the media picked up on the story, the world erupted. The headlines now read, "New documents expose Jonathan Fields as key player in arms smuggling and military coup funding." The backlash from Fields' camp was nothing short of frantic. Legal teams scrambled to make statements, trying to discredit the new evidence. But there was no denying it now. The proof was irrefutable. This wasn't just about resource manipulation or controlling economies anymore. Fields was involved in the financing of military coups, sponsoring violent regimes that crushed innocent civilians in the name of profit. Within hours, global leaders were being asked for statements. Major corporations tied to Fields began to feel the heat. International aid organizations were under scrutiny. The world was demanding answers. Fields himself had gone silent. But it didn't stop there. Just as the first wave of shock started to settle in, the next shoe dropped. An anonymous source came forward. It was someone who had been within USAID for years, an insider who had witnessed firsthand the corruption that ran through the agency's veins. They had proof that USAID had knowingly been complicit in Fields' dealings, turning a blind eye to the abuse and exploitation that was taking place. Musk and Sarah received a new set of documents, each one more damning than the last. The insider had given them access to files that tied key members of USAID directly to Fields. These weren't just vague connections anymore. These were clear, documented exchanges, showing that top USAID officials had been taking bribes in exchange for facilitating Fields' operations. It was a bombshell. Musk sat at his desk, looking at the new documents, feeling the weight of what they had just uncovered. The plan was working, but the stakes were higher than ever. They were no longer just battling Fields. They were taking down an entire network of corruption that reached deep into governments, corporations, and organizations. Worldwide. He looked up at Sarah, who was also deep in thought. "This is just the beginning," he said quietly. "We've started a fire and there's no going back." Sarah nodded, her expression resolute. "Let's make sure it burns everything down." The world had been shaken to its core. The latest revelations, especially the involvement of USAID in Fields' operation, had set off a global political earthquake. Musk and Sarah had become the unlikely whistleblowers who were forcing the world to reckon with a new reality, one where the very institutions people trusted were tainted with corruption. For the first time, Fields' empire seemed vulnerable. The steady stream of public outrage was too loud to ignore, and the media was relentless. Investigations were launched, and governments around the world began to demand accountability. The public was no longer on Fields' side. But this was only the beginning. Musk and Sarah sat in the war room, a dimly lit room in Musk's private estate, filled with monitors showing news outlets from around the world. They had gathered a small elite team of advisors, cybersecurity experts and journalists, all dedicated to one thing: seeing Fields exposed. "This is the turning point," Musk said, pacing in front of a whiteboard covered in scribbles, names, and connections. "But we need to keep the pressure on. If we let up now, they'll just regroup and try to bury this. We can't give them that chance." Sarah nodded, her fingers tapping anxiously on the table. "We've made them bleed, but Fields still has connections everywhere. We've rattled his allies, but they're going to fight back. Hard. The next move is critical." As if on cue, Musk's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number popped up on the screen. "They know. They're coming for you." Musk stared at the message, his stomach tightening. Who was this and how did they know? He quickly sent a reply, asking for more information, but the message never came through. "What does it mean?" Sarah asked, noticing his expression. "I don't know," Musk replied, his voice grim. "But I think it's a warning." The warning proved to be accurate. 2 days later, Fields' team issued a new wave of counterattacks. This time, they were more subtle and far more dangerous. Fields had powerful allies in the tech world, people who knew how to control narratives, manipulate data, and even sabotage efforts from the inside. A coordinated cyber attack hit Musk's network, taking down several of his systems, including his private communication channels. They tried to break into his private databases, hoping to erase the evidence Musk had so carefully compiled over the past few months. It was an attempt to silence them, to erase the digital footprints of their investigation. But Musk was prepared. His security team had anticipated such an attack and had already set up defensive countermeasures. The breach was contained quickly, but the message was clear. Fields wasn't just trying to protect his wealth and reputation anymore. He was fighting for survival. "Do you think he's behind this?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with concern. Musk didn't hesitate. "He has the resources. He's not just going to roll over. But we can't stop now. This fight is bigger than him." The cyber attack was just one of many signs that Fields was escalating his efforts to crush the investigation. The deeper Musk and Sarah dug, the more they realized how far the corruption spread. It wasn't just about Fields, it was about the entire system that had allowed men like him to operate with impunity. As pressure mounted on Fields, his allies in the government were also feeling the heat. Senior officials who had once been untouchable were now under investigation, and the public scrutiny was growing more intense by the hour. Fields had been a master at manipulating political systems, but even he couldn't stop the unraveling of his empire. Musk knew they had to strike hard and strike fast. The moment Fields was caught in a corner, he would do anything to escape. But it wasn't just Fields Musk needed to worry about. The people who had helped him, those who profited from his web of corruption, were just as dangerous. Musk's network of contacts had told him that several of them had already begun working behind the scenes to sabotage the investigation, using their political influence to mislead the public and deflect attention away from Fields. It was time for Musk to make the next move. He called Sarah into his office, and they sat down to discuss the final stage of their plan. The goal was clear. They needed to bring down Fields once and for all, but they couldn't do it alone. "We have to leak the final set of documents," Musk said, his voice steady with resolve. "But we need to get the right people involved. We need public pressure to be so overwhelming that Fields has no way out. We need the full weight of the international community on his back." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure? Once we release the last documents, it's going to set off a chain reaction. Fields won't be able to hide, and there will be nowhere for him to run." Musk met her gaze. "I'm sure. The world needs to know the truth. We can't stop until he's brought to justice." The next few days were a blur of final preparations. They reached out to key allies in the media and intelligence community, carefully selecting who would be trusted with the final set of explosive documents. The information contained detailed financial transactions that linked Fields to offshore accounts, high-ranking officials, and shadowy figures from the criminal underworld. Once the documents were prepared and the contacts were lined up, Musk and Sarah took a final step that would push the investigation to its tipping point. They went public with their final game-changing piece of evidence, an encrypted video recording of a conversation between Fields and several top USAID officials. In it, Fields openly discussed manipulating aid programs for personal gain, directly implicating not only himself but also key players in the US government. The recording was damning. As soon as the video was released, all hell broke loose. It went viral within hours, with millions of views across every platform. The public outcry was immediate and deafening. International organizations condemned Fields, and calls for his arrest came from every corner of the globe. Fields was no longer just a businessman. He was the face of a global conspiracy that had been allowed to flourish under the radar for years. The world now knew that the money meant to help the most vulnerable had been funneled into the hands of the few who sought to profit from war, suffering, and destruction. That night, as the news continued to break, Musk sat quietly in his office. The gravity of what had just occurred was setting in. They had exposed a global network of corruption, but the battle wasn't over. Fields would fight back, and so would his allies. But for the first time since this all began, Musk felt something he hadn't in a long time. Hope. The truth had been revealed, and the world would have to deal with it. Sarah entered the room, sitting across from him with a small, knowing smile. "We did it." Musk nodded slowly, the weight of everything still settling on his shoulders. "This is just the beginning." The aftermath of the final revelation was a whirlwind of media coverage, public outrage, and political upheaval. Fields had become the most wanted man in the world, his empire crumbling beneath the weight of his own deception. What Musk and Sarah had uncovered could no longer be swept under the rug. For the first time, powerful people were held accountable for their actions, and there was no turning back. Yet, as the global spotlight turned toward Fields, Musk and Sarah knew that their victory was not yet complete. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. In a world where money and influence ran deep, there were always those willing to protect their own, no matter the cost. Musk sat at his desk, his face tense, eyes locked on the breaking news. Fields' arrest had made headlines across the globe. But the real fight was happening behind closed doors. Powerful figures within governments, corporations, and international organizations were circling the wagons, determined to protect their own interests and prevent further damage. Musk knew they would do anything to cover their tracks. "This is where it gets dangerous," Sarah said, standing across from him. "Fields is in custody, but the people who helped him, those who were in on it, they won't just go quietly." Musk didn't reply immediately. He was deep in thought, processing the magnitude of the situation. They had toppled one giant, but others were lurking in the shadows, waiting for their moment to strike. The phone on his desk buzzed. A message flashed on the screen from an unknown number. "You've made your move, but now the real game begins. You have no idea who you're up against." Musk's stomach twisted. The message was clear. Someone else was pulling strings, someone who wanted to make sure this investigation never went further. "I think it's time we get ahead of them," Musk said, locking eyes with Sarah. "They want to shut us down. But we're not stopping now. It's time for the final play." Musk and Sarah had spent months piecing together the vast network of corruption, but the pieces still didn't add up. They knew the scope of Fields' operation, but there were still questions that would lead them to the heart of the conspiracy. Now with Fields in custody, Musk was determined to follow the trail all the way to the top. They needed a plan, something that would draw out the real masterminds behind Fields' empire. They would need to rely on a mix of strategic leaks, hidden alliances, and the most cutting-edge technology at their disposal. They had the documents, they had the video evidence, and now they needed a final push. Over the next few days, they carefully crafted their next move. They used encrypted channels to reach out to a select group of high-profile whistleblowers within the government and private sector. They needed people who had access to the highest levels of information, those who could pull the curtain back on the shadowy figures who had been working behind the scenes. Musk was well aware of the risks. These were not just average criminals. They were well-connected, dangerous people who would stop at nothing to preserve their empire. And now that Musk and Sarah had made themselves targets, they couldn't afford to slip up. "We'll leak the next round of information," Sarah suggested, her voice low. "But this time it has to come from someone they won't expect, someone they trust. If we can shake up their inner circle, maybe they'll finally crack." Musk thought it over. "It's risky, but we don't have a choice. We have to turn their own tactics against them. We have to break the trust between them." The team worked around the clock preparing the next set of explosive documents. These weren't just more financial transactions or incriminating videos. They were more personal. An encrypted file showing secret meetings between high-ranking government officials and the heads of powerful corporations. The evidence pointed to a global cabal operating behind the scenes, pulling strings to control everything from international aid to military operations. But there was a twist this time. One of the names on the list was someone they never expected, a former high-ranking government official who had once been a close ally of Musk. As the team continued to sift through the files, they discovered a shocking connection. The same official had been the one who introduced Fields to some of the most influential players in the world. This wasn't just about financial corruption. It was about a covert network of power brokers operating at the highest levels of government, military, and business. These people weren't just manipulating economies. They were controlling the very narrative of global politics. Musk's mind raced. If they could expose this person, it would be the final blow, an act that would unravel the entire system that had allowed Fields and his ilk to operate for so long. The plan was set into motion. With one final, carefully calculated leak, the EE team released the incriminating documents, linking the former official to the heart of the conspiracy. The media exploded once again. News outlets were inundated with reports of the former official's involvement in Field's operation, and the scandal quickly spread across the globe. World leaders were forced to address the issue, and calls for further investigations came from every corner of the political spectrum. Musk watched the storm unfold from his office, a mixture of satisfaction and trepidation swirling inside him. They had done it. The final piece was in place. The people behind the scenes were finally exposed, but with victory came the inevitable cost. They had made powerful enemies, and they were now being hunted. That night, as Musk and Sarah were debriefing, with their team, the phone rang. Musk's eyes narrowed when he saw the number, an unknown encrypted line. He answered. "Musk," a voice said, its tone cold and detached. "You've won this round, but you've made a dangerous mistake. You have no idea who you're really dealing with. The game's not over, not by a long shot." The call ended abruptly, and Musk was left staring at the phone, a chill running down his spine. The final showdown was only beginning. Fields was in custody, but the people who had been protecting him, the true masterminds of the operation, were still out there. They would stop at nothing to preserve their empire. But Musk and Sarah were ready for whatever came next. They had fought back against the corruption, exposed the darkest corners of global politics, and taken down one of the most powerful men in the world. But the war was far from over, and Musk wasn't about to stop until the final pieces of the puzzle were in place. The world was watching, and the pressure was mounting. Every major news outlet was consumed by the latest revelations. Fields had been exposed, and his empire was crumbling. But as the dust began to settle, Musk and Sarah knew one thing for certain. The final hour had arrived. Fields might be behind bars, but those who had helped him, the true power players, were still out there lurking in the shadows. The mysterious call Musk had received left him unsettled. Who were these people? How far did their reach go? And how could they be stopped when they seemed so untouchable? It had been days since the explosive final leak, and things were changing rapidly. The media continued to explode with new information, and world leaders were facing the fallout. But beneath the chaos, there were whispers of something bigger, a coordinated effort to discredit the investigation and silence anyone who dared to go further. Musk paced back and forth in his private war room, scanning the room full of monitors, each showing a different feed of breaking news. Every now and then he glanced at Sarah, who sat quietly analyzing every new piece of information. They had gotten this far, but there were still countless loose ends. They needed to find the next step, something that would expose the full scope of the conspiracy once and for all. Sarah broke the silence. "We've crossed a line. The people we're up against, they have too much power. They won't let this go." Musk stopped pacing and turned to face her. His jaw clenched. "I know, but that's exactly why we can't stop now. If we back down now, everything we've done, everything we've fought for, will be in vain." The atmosphere in the room was tense as they worked to uncover the next set of clues, the encrypted communications, the deep connections within global politics, and the web of corruption were all interconnected. But there was something they hadn't anticipated. Fields's arrest was only the tip of the iceberg. The investigation had exposed only a fraction of the corruption at play. And now Musk and Sarah had to dig deeper, much deeper. They managed to track down one more name, a high-ranking intelligence officer who had been directly involved in orchestrating the global conspiracy that had been years in the making. This was the final piece of the puzzle. If they could expose this officer's connections, they would be able to bring down the entire operation. But the deeper they dug, the more dangerous things became. The intelligence officer was not only powerful, but they had a far-reaching network of loyal operatives within the government, military, and corporations. Musk and Sarah had to be careful. One wrong move and everything they'd worked for could collapse. Musk knew that the only way to move forward was to confront the core of the conspiracy head-on. There would be no more subtle leaks or calculated moves. This time they would have to force the hand of those who thought they were untouchable. It was time to expose the final player in the game, someone with the power to manipulate entire nations. Musk contacted a trusted source within the intelligence community, someone who had been feeding them critical information for months. The source confirmed that the intelligence officer they had traced was the key to everything. This officer had been using their position to manipulate global policy, control resources, and keep the system of corruption in place. "Are you ready for this?" Sarah asked, her voice calm but filled with determination. "Once we go after this officer, there's no turning back." Musk looked at her with a steely resolve. "We've come too far to stop now. Let's finish this." The next few days were a blur of strategy and preparation. They worked around the clock to assemble all the evidence they had: financial records, intercepted communications, confidential reports, and crafted a plan to release it all at once. But this time they needed more than just media coverage. They needed action. They reached out to a global coalition of whistleblowers, activists, and journalists who were committed to seeing justice done. Together, they would flood the media with the final batch of information, and in doing so expose the last part of the conspiracy. But even as they prepared to make their move, Musk received another cryptic message. "You're out of time. We've been watching you." It was from the same anonymous source who had warned him before. They were closer than Musk realized. The final pieces fell into place. The documents were ready. The whistleblowers were in position, and the world was waiting for the final reveal. Musk and Sarah knew they had one shot to expose the truth. On the day of the final release, they were in constant contact with their trusted team. The media was primed, the public ready to erupt. As the first articles went live, the world was gripped by shock. The intelligence officer had been using their position to manipulate entire governments, orchestrating covert operations that spanned continents, all while lining their pockets with stolen wealth. The evidence was undeniable. In one swift move, Musk and Sarah had taken down the last piece of the puzzle. The intelligence officer, along with their network of supporters, was exposed. The global conspiracy had been revealed in all its ugly truth. The fallout was immediate. Governments scrambled to respond, and international bodies called for urgent investigations. The intelligence officer was arrested, and the web of corruption that had spanned decades began to unravel in real time. Musk and Sarah watched the events unfold, knowing they had made a difference. Fields was only the first step. Now the entire system of global corruption was being exposed. The people who had once thought they were invincible were being held accountable, and the world would never be the same. But there was one last question that lingered. Was this the end of the battle, or was it just the beginning? Musk stared out. The window, the weight of the past months pressing on him. He'd brought down a corrupt system, but at what cost? The enemies they had made along the way were not the kind to forget easily. There would be consequences for the truth, and the road ahead would be dangerous. Still, Musk didn't regret a single decision. They had taken on the most powerful forces in the world and had come out on top. But he knew they couldn't rest. There would always be more battles to fight, more corruption to expose, and no matter what happened next, Musk would be ready. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?